Remember walking into Toys R Us in 1987? The shelves were packed with G.I. Joe, Transformers, Mask. Every aisle was a battlefield for your allowance money. But tucked in the back corner, there was this weird-looking toy line with pneumatic pumps and air-powered missiles that looked like nothing else on the shelf. That was Air Raiders. And here's the thing, most people who were there don't even remember it. It vanished almost overnight. But get this, Air Raiders wasn't just another failed toy line trying to cash in on the 80s action figure craze. It was actually one of the most ambitious toy lines Hasbro ever created. We're talking real engineering innovation, a fully developed sci-fi universe, and a script written by the guy who penned Transformers, the movie. And yet, it completely bombed. So what the hell happened? Air Raiders wasn't killed by bad toys or a weak concept. It was killed by a perfect storm of corporate cost-cutting, terrible timing, and one crucial mistake that every 80s toy line lived or died by, and Air Raiders got it catastrophically wrong. By the end of this video, you're going to know exactly why Air Raiders failed, what made it so special, and why collectors are still hunting for these toys today. Plus, I'm going to show you the canceled toys that never made it to shelves. And trust me, seeing what could have been makes this story even more tragic. The concept. So picture this. It's early 1986. Hasbro's riding high on G.I. Joe and Transformers, billion-dollar franchises. And designer Steve Rice wants to do something completely different. Not soldiers, not robots that turn into cars. He wants to make a toy line about air. Now, I know what you're thinking. Air? Like wind? But here's where it gets interesting. Rice wasn't thinking about air like a weather report. He was thinking Dune. You know, that sci-fi novel where the most valuable resource in the universe is spice? Well, Rice wanted to do the same thing, but with breathable air. The pitch. There's a planet called Airlandia. Yes, that's the actual name. And something catastrophic happened to the atmosphere. The air became toxic, unbreathable. And the only safe air left is controlled by this totalitarian dictator named Emperor Aerozar and his faction called the Tyrants of Wind. I mean, come on, Tyrants of Wind? That's a metal band name waiting to happen. Fighting against them? The Air Raiders, a rebel group hiding out in the petrified cloud forest, which sounds like a prog rock album cover. Now, here's the kicker. Every vehicle, every weapon, every playset ran on actual pneumatic power. You'd pump air into these bellows, connect tubes between vehicles, and launch missiles using real compressed air. No batteries, no motors, just you, a pump, and the laws of physics. For 1987, that was genuinely innovative. Fred Reber, one of the main designers, basically turned Hasbro's engineering department into a physics lab. They were figuring out air release valves, pressure capacitors, and modular tubing systems just to make these toys work. Fun fact, this was originally called Airmasters. They were deep into development under that name before marketing realized Air Raiders sounded way cooler. Honestly, good call. The team behind it. If you're going to launch a new toy line in the 80s, you don't mess around with your design team. And Hasbro absolutely stacked the deck. Fred Reber and Dan Price were leading product design. But here's the part that blew my mind. Ron Rudat designed the Hawkwind vehicle. If that name doesn't ring a bell, let me explain. Ron Rudat designed pretty much all your favorite G.I. Joe characters. Snake Eyes, Rudat, Storm Shadow, Rudat, the Night Raven jet, also Rudat. This guy was Hasbro's secret weapon, and they put him on Air Raiders. He took the same sleek, aerodynamic design language from the Night Raven and applied it to the Hawkwind. And it wasn't just the toys. They hired Ron Friedman, the legend who wrote the G.I. Joe miniseries and Transformers, the movie, to write a 5-part animated pilot. 5 full episodes. Friedman delivered the script. It was done. Ready to go. They had the whole thing mapped out. Emperor Aerozar as this genuinely cruel villain, the Air Raiders as a sophisticated rebel cell, wild, imaginative visuals that pushed the boundaries of 80s cartoons. And then, nothing. The show never got made. The animation disaster. Okay, so here's where things start falling apart, and it all comes down to money. By 1987, the relationship between Hasbro and Sunbow Entertainment, the animation studio behind G.I. Joe and Transformers, was getting rocky. Those billion-dollar sales figures, they were starting to decline, and Sunbow's animation model was expensive. They were outsourcing to Toei Animation in Japan, working with Marvel Productions, and the overhead was massive. Then, you've got the gem disaster. Hasbro's attempt at a fashion doll line to compete with Barbie absolutely tanked, putting serious financial pressure on the company. So when it came time to greenlight the Air Raiders animated series, Hasbro looked at the budget and basically said, yeah, no. They couldn't justify the investment in a completely unproven property when they were already cutting costs on established shows. And that decision, that's what killed Air Raiders. Because here's the thing about 80s toy lines. You needed three things to succeed: toys, comics, and cartoons. That was the holy trinity. You needed all three working together to build the kind of character-driven loyalty that kept kids buying toys for years. Without the cartoon, Air Raiders was basically going into battle with one hand tied behind its back. They did make some commercials with voice actors from the G.I. Joe cast: Chris Latta, Neil Ross, Peter Cullen, A-list voice talent. But a 30-second commercial is not the same as a weekly cartoon. Kids couldn't fall in love with characters they only saw for half a minute. They couldn't get invested in the world. They couldn't build that emotional connection. And without that connection, the toys were just cool pneumatic gimmicks sitting on a shelf. The comic book attempt. Now, Hasbro did try to make up for the lack of animation. They partnered with Marvel Comics to launch an Air Raiders series under their Star Comics imprint. The series ran 5 issues from November 1987 to July 1988. And here's what's wild. These comics were actually good. Writer Howard Mackie, with art by Kelly Jones and Jim Sinclair, took the concept seriously. Issue number 1, Sins of the Father, dealt with whether a rebellion has the moral right to sacrifice innocent people for strategic goals. That's heavy stuff for a toy commercial disguised as a comic book. And there was this character named Eleta, a female Air Raider warrior who was basically a main protagonist. She was tough, strategic, important to the story. But here's the problem. Hasbro never made an Eleta action figure. Why? Because of the idiotic 80s marketing belief that boys wouldn't buy female characters. So they created this rich, complex character in the comics, and then gave kids absolutely no way to play with her. Can you imagine being a kid reading those comics and wanting to recreate the stories, but the main character just doesn't exist? That's actively sabotaging your own product. And by early 1988, Marvel was shutting down the Star Comics imprint. The gap between issue 4 and 5 was several months, right when the toy line was getting pulled from major retailers. Total mess. The toys themselves. But let's talk about what Hasbro actually got right, because the toys themselves were legitimately impressive. That pneumatic system wasn't just a gimmick. These toys required genuine engineering precision. Air-powered missiles, exploding trap doors, scissor arm activation mechanisms, all running on compressed air. Fred Reber told this great story about pitching the Wind Reaper vehicle to Hasbro executives. He didn't have a prototype budget, so you know what he did? He bought a Mattel preschool floor sweeper, tore it apart, and cobbled together a working scissor arm mechanism to demonstrate the concept. It worked. They greenlit the vehicle. And they thought about everything. Most 80s toys had clear plastic cockpit canopies with hinges, right? Air Raiders didn't have hinges. The canopies just snapped on and off. Why? Because Reber knew that clear plastic hinges would break under the stress of pneumatic play. Kids would be pumping air, launching missiles, and those hinges would snap off within a week. So instead of making a convenient design, they made a durable one. They even created a complete pictograph alphabet for Airlandia. Look at the stickers on the vehicles. Those aren't random symbols. That's an actual functional alphabet designed by Reber and production designer Dave Slayton. Nobody asked them to do this. It was just world building for world building's sake. And I love it. The fatal flaw. But here's where all that innovation ran headfirst into a massive problem: scale. To fit all those pneumatic pumps and air tubes into the vehicles, Hasbro had to make the action figures only 2 inches tall. 2 inches. And in 1987, that was a death sentence. G.I. Joe figures were 3.75 inches. That was the standard. Kids had dozens of G.I. Joe figures. Their friends had them. They could mix and match, trade, build whole armies. Air Raiders figures? They couldn't interact with anything else. They were too small for G.I. Joe vehicles. Too big for Micro Machines. They existed in this weird in-between scale that made them incompatible with every other toy line. And that's huge, because cross-compatibility was one of the secrets to 80s toy success. Companies like Remco built entire businesses on making toys that worked with other popular lines. Air Raiders? They were an island. A really cool, pneumatically powered island, but still isolated. Plus, the Command Outpost playset cost over $20, which in 1987, money was significant. That's around $50 today. For a toy line with no cartoon, limited comics, and figures that didn't work with anything else you owned. Tough sell. And let's talk about what Air Raiders was competing against. In 1987, Hasbro was essentially competing with itself. They were simultaneously launching Air Raiders, Visionaries, and continuing G.I. Joe, Transformers, and My Little Pony. That's not even counting other companies. Matchbox had MASK. Kenner had Star Wars residuals. Battle Beasts, Inhumanoids, a dozen toy lines fighting for the same shelf space and allowance money. In that environment, Air Raiders needed every advantage. Then, 2 years later, Matchbox launched Ring Raiders, another air battle toy line with tiny planes. And Ring Raiders had something Air Raiders didn't: a cartoon. Only 5 episodes, but it existed. Ring Raiders still failed, by the way, but at least it got its shot. Now here's where the story gets really tragic. By late 1987, Hasbro knew Air Raiders was struggling, so the design team pivoted. They had a plan for 1988. Bring the price point way down, make the toys more accessible, give the line a second chance. And they actually designed a whole new wave of toys. Prototypes were built. Products were photographed for catalogs. There was the Gatling, a rapid-fire air-powered weapon station, the Whirlwind troop carrier, the Cyclone scout vehicle, battle dashers called Windshear and Vortex. All of these were designed to retail under $10, making them impulse buys instead of major purchases. The Gatling even had a finished prototype built by model maker Don DeLuca. It was done, ready to manufacture. But when the 1988 Toy Fair catalog went to print, Air Raiders wasn't in it. Hasbro pulled the entire line before the second wave could launch. All those new toys, all that design work, just canceled. You can find those pre-production photos online. It's heartbreaking. You can see exactly what we almost got. The aftermath. So Air Raiders died in 1988, barely a year after launch. By mid-1988, remaining stock was being dumped at discount retailers like TJ Maxx and KB Toys. That toy line Hasbro thought could be the next billion-dollar franchise ended up in the clearance bin next to failed board games and off-brand action figures. But here's the interesting part. Air Raiders never really went away. The people who actually owned these toys as kids, they remembered them. Because even though the line failed commercially, the toys themselves were genuinely good. That pneumatic system worked. The play pattern was unique. And the world building stuck with people. So over the years, a small but dedicated collector community formed. And because the line only lasted a year, Air Raiders toys became rare. Complete sets started commanding serious money. You can find Command outposts and air refineries on eBay today, and if they're sealed in mint condition, we're talking hundreds of dollars. The real prize is finding sets where the pneumatic systems still work, because those rubber bellows degrade over time. And then, a few years ago, someone leaked Ron Friedman's unproduced pilot script online. Fans could finally read what the show would have been. And it's good. Really good. That discovery kicked off a whole new wave of interest. YouTube videos analyzing the line, podcast episodes about 80s toy failures, blog posts breaking down the engineering. Air Raiders became this cult classic, the toy line that should have succeeded. So what's the takeaway here? Why does the story of Air Raiders matter almost 40 years later? Because it's a perfect case study in how even the best ideas can fail if the execution isn't there. Hasbro had talented designers. They had innovative engineering. They had a unique concept and a fully developed world. They had Ron Friedman writing the animated series. But they didn't have the commitment to see it through. The Sunbow partnership collapsed at exactly the wrong time. The decision to skip the animated series gutted the marketing strategy. The 2-inch scale isolated the toys from the broader market, and launching multiple new toy lines simultaneously spread Hasbro's resources too thin. Any one of those problems could have been overcome, but all of them together, it was too much. We remember the winners: G.I. Joe, Transformers, He-Man, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. But for every success, there were dozens of failures. Toy lines that had potential but got crushed by bad timing, corporate politics, or the brutal realities of a saturated market. Air Raiders deserved better. The designers deserved better. The kids who loved those toys deserved to see where the story went. So that's the story of Air Raiders, a toy line that had everything going for it, except the one thing it needed most: a cartoon to bring the world to life. If you lived through the 80s toy boom, you probably have your own memories of Air Raiders, or maybe this is the first you're hearing about it. Either way, it's one of those weird little corners of toy history that deserves to be remembered. Because in the end, Air Raiders wasn't a failure of imagination. It was a failure of execution. And that's somehow sadder. If you're curious about other forgotten toy lines from the 80s, I've got a whole video breaking down why Visionaries failed despite having one of the coolest gimmicks ever: literal holograms on action figures. That video's linked right there. And trust me, that story is just as wild as this one. Thanks for watching. See you next time.